Exhibition has been central to museums since their origin. Exhibition is a specific mode of representation that privileges sight over other senses and visually orders objects to represent larger systems of knowledge and power. We can look, for instance, to Tony Bennett's work on the exhibitionary complex, in which he describes the transfer of objects and bodies from enclosed and private domains into progressively more open and public arenas, where, through the representations to which they were subjected, they formed vehicles for inscribing and broadcasting messages of power. This slideshow is going to go through a visual genealogy of that exhibitionary complex, looking at the origin of collections and exhibitions from their beginnings to the present day. Exhibitions have their origins in the Cabinet of Curiosities, in German Wunderkammer. In the Cabinet of Curiosities, we see a collection of notable objects. And I would also note that the original term Kammer, or cabinet, meant room, so a chamber of objects. Cabinets of Curiosities have their origins in the Renaissance. The collections they contain could be oddities or scientific specimens representing the complexity of creation. Collections were arranged in encyclopedic fashion, asserting dominance over the natural and human worlds, showcasing intellect, experience, and taste. Skeletons, fossils, insects, birds' nests, taxidermy specimens were collected alongside works of art, scientific instruments, ancient texts, and artifacts. A wonderful example of this Cabinet of Curiosities is Olworm's Cabinet of Curiosities. And this engraving is a frontispiece for the catalog for the cabinet. Olworm was a 17th century Danish physician, linguist, and natural philosopher who created one of the first museums, the Museum Wormianum. I think that's how you say it, a cabinet of curiosities in his home. Displayed in the cabinet were specimens of the natural world, scientific instruments, and ethnographic objects. The intention was to create a spectacle, but also a source of study and understanding, as Worm wanted to touch and see things and reflect on their meaning outside of their natural environments. Here, meaning was dependent on the way in which the collector saw the collection, creating relationships of meaning through display, visual relationships, and their own associations between objects. Interestingly, Worm's cabinet was recreated by artist Jens Purcell in the installation One Room, first exhibited at the Santa Monica Museum of Art. This exhibit traveled to other museums, including the Geological Museum at the Natural History Museum of Denmark in Copenhagen, where it's been installed since 2011. Around 40 of the original items from Worm's cabinet, such as the jaw of a horse grown around a root, still exist, and some are even held in that museum. Another famous Cabinet of Curiosities was that of the Baron Joseph Bonier de l'Aubusson, represented here in an 18th century painting by Jacques Delajou. Bonier de l'Aubusson's cabinet is recreated in the library attached to the Museum of Natural History in the Jardin des Plantes in Paris. The cabinet dates back to 1735, and it was originally housed in de l'Aubusson's home, amassed and exhibited thanks to a family fortune based on the procurement of regional taxes. The cabinet has the quality of combining the atmospheric quality of the Wunderkammer with the organizational intent of later scientific cabinets, producing an original blend of system and fantasy. These wooden cases were acquired by the naturalist Buffon for the Jardin de Roy in 1744, when they were auctioned off following the death of de la Masson, who died penniless. They were installed in the King's Garden Room. Inside these 5 units, made from Dutch wood and decorated with serpents, were a collection of preserved animals. This was disassembled in 1935 and then restored and definitively reinstalled in the Museum Central Library in 1979 and is now considered a historic monument. Bonier de l'Aubusson's cabinet represents a shift in the technologies of display to embody knowledge and power, with the transfer of objects and bodies from enclosed and private domains into progressively more open and public arenas. As Bennett points out, these new exhibitionary forms simultaneously ordered objects for public inspection and ordered the public that expected them. One early example is Peale's Philadelphia Museum, which opened in Philadelphia was inspired by 18th century Enlightenment ideals, celebrating mankind's capacity to learn and use new information. The artist Charles Wilson Peale conceived his museum as a place the works of man and nature could coexist for the edification of all. The Philadelphia Museum, Peale said, served to, quote, instruct the mind and sow the seeds of virtue in the new American Republic. For nearly 50 years, Peale and his family filled the museum with hundreds of painted portraits, thousands of natural history specimens, minerals, models, Asian and American Indian artifacts, archaeological objects, life-size wax figures, fossils, and curiosities, all exhibited to an international public. The Wagner Free Institute of Science, also in Philadelphia, is perhaps the best-known surviving example of this kind of 19th century natural history museum. Located in Philadelphia, its exhibits still display artifacts in their original setting, with the artifacts arranged to show the categorizations of flora and fauna according to scientific classification. Perhaps my favorite case is the one that illustrates the various species of primates, from monkey to chimpanzee to human, embodying through the changing skeletal forms the process of evolution. The point here is to also emphasize humans as the culmination of progress. The impulse to categorize, order, and embody was also applied to other human cultures with similar trajectories of primitive progressing to civilization, as we will see in the later international exhibitions. In addition to the need for order, exhibition also relies on display. Visual cultures of display are considered a hallmark of modernity, and this impulse to order and categorize was married in the 19th century with an emergent mode of modern cultures of looking and the rise of what we would call the modern gaze. This culture of looking was tied to visual technologies like exhibition. Early forms, in addition to art galleries, were panoramas, cycloramas, and other spectacles in which visitors could experience a kind of virtual reality. A panorama was a large circular painting that aimed to give the viewer the experience of being physically present in the scene being depicted, whether that was a landscape, a city, a battle, or other historical event. And here you can see resemblances to the later cycloramas. There was also the diorama, courtesy of the French inventor Louis Daguerre, also responsible for the daguerreotype, another important feature of this new culture of looking. Daguerre created the first diorama, a cousin of the panorama, and it was one of his many inventions, a multimedia spectacle that took the mid-19th century by storm. The first diorama was constructed in 1822 behind the Place de Château d'Eau, now the Place de République. Daguerre's studio and the area was shabby and underdeveloped at the time, consisting of old army barracks and a smattering of theaters. Once customers entered the theater, however, they soon forgot the dilapidated surroundings and were transported virtually to places and moments in history: the Black Forest, the inauguration of the Temple of Solomon, the Great Fire of Edinburgh. The diorama quickly grew extremely popular, garnering as much as 200,000 francs a year during its heyday, which was a remarkable profit for that era. Diorama theaters were built in London and Berlin, with the most famous tableau touring between cities. These forms of visual experience linked the early museum to other forms of spectacle and popular entertainment like Barnum's Museum, which displayed oddities and pseudo-scientific objects as a popular middle-class entertainment. And as a popular entertainment, we would locate Barnum's Museum on a spectrum, with the museum on one end and the circus and other popular 19th century entertainment on the other. The museum took the liminal and potentially transgressive disorder of the other, the circus, or the other with a capital O, and the spectacle, and tamed it through order, containing it under a glass as an object of study. And this reminds us of Bennett's point that the 19th century was quite unprecedented in the social effort devoted to the organization of spectacles, arranged for an increasingly large and undifferentiated public. Society itself also became spectacle. The fusion of entertainment and edification and spectacle found its clearest expression in the spate of international exhibitions that punctuated the mid to late 19th century. One of the first of these was the Crystal Palace in London in 1851. And you can see the fact that the Crystal Palace was made of glass also kind of increases this sense not only of spectacle, but also of surveillance. Bennett writes, the Crystal Palace might serve as the emblem of an architectural series which could be ranged against that of the asylum, school, and prison in its continuing concern with the display of objects to a great multitude. The Crystal Palace reversed the panoptical principle by fixing the eyes of the multitude upon an assemblage of glamorous commodities. The panopticon was designed so that everyone could be seen. The Crystal Palace was designed so that everyone could see. The mode was replicated in the Crystal Palace in New York in 1853. And then with a similar modus operandi, the Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia in 1876. This exhibition was intended to celebrate the centennial of the United States and transform displays of machinery and industrial process, as well as finished products and objets d'art, into material signifiers of progress, but of progress as a collective national achievement, with capital as the great coordinator. And it's no accident that there were also links to display and emerging consumer culture, embodied in the department store as a spectacle of progress. And here we have John Wanamaker's department store in Philadelphia in the 1880s, which resembled the exhibition in both internally. Here we have the inner ordering of the store resembling the panopticon, and architecturally in its resemblance to the exhibition pavilion. The visual ordering of things and peoples reaches its apotheosis in the Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893, which united spectacle with the visual ordering of knowledge, displaying the worlds of diverse peoples in virtual realities or dioramic settings. These displays showed the progress of culture, with the U.S. as the height of achievement, U.S. imperialism and industrialization. The exhibition also displayed other cultures, many of them on the Midway, which had a closer connection to the circus, as former stages of human development. Here power was produced through the ordered representation of otherness, and moreover that order was a totalizing one, which organized the implied public, the white citizenries of the imperialist power, into a unity, representationally effacing divisions within that body politic, constructing a we conceived as the realization of, and therefore the just beneficiary of, the processes of evolution, identified in opposition to the primitive otherness of conquered peoples. Museums and expositions, in drawing on the techniques and rhetorics of display and pedagogic relations developed in earlier 19th century exhibitionary forms, provided a context in which the working and middle-class publics could be brought together, and the former, having been tutored in forms of behavior to suit them for the occasion, could be exposed to the improving influence of the latter. American art museums founded during the Gilded Age and Progressive Era were established as civic institutions intended to provide civilizing influence to an urban public, even if the parochial worldview of their founders limited their democratic potential. The prototypical institution of the Progressive Era was the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which opened in 1870 after a prolonged effort of organization by civic leaders, businessmen, artists, art collectors, and philanthropists. The museum acquired its first object that same year, a Roman sarcophagus, and later important European paintings entered the collection. And the museum opened to the public at its current site in 1880. The Met stood at the center of this movement to preserve artifacts from the American past and for social change through Americanization. Its organizers believed that tasteful urban and domestic environments contributed to good citizenship and recognized the economic advantages of improving American industrial production through design education. And if you want to know more about the genesis of the Met, you can definitely check out Professor Jeffrey Trask's book, Things American. Since the 1990s, museums have embraced a new museology that explores new exhibition strategies that both reinforce and challenge the terms of the historic exhibitionary complex. Where can we identify that legacy of the exhibitionary complex in contemporary museums? And how are museums addressing that legacy?